Hello. We are moving into a new work group for our CES assessment and prioritization refinement project for this year, so it's a good time to give an update on what has already happened and what's happening next. I'm going to start by laying the foundation. Why are we doing this work in the first place? The main reason is to build more trust and equity in our CES assessment by removing the VI-SPDAT. That has been a community goal since early 2021 and has been discussed even before that. But we know that the VI-SPDAT is not an equitable tool. We're not using it the way it was originally intended, and the people who created it stopped supporting it. So we're trying to find something that's more localized and effective in our community. We also want to ease administration of the assessment. It is a lengthy enrollment, and it is required for anybody experiencing homelessness who wants to be on the waiting list for COC housing resources. So in order to be on that wait list, people have to go to an access point and do a CES enrollment with a skilled assessor. The enrollment is a pretty lengthy list of questions right now, and so we're hoping to ease the burden of time for the people asking and answering the questions. We also want to manage underreporting and improve the accuracy of vulnerability measures in the assessment, address nuances in vulnerability, and build a structure to continuously monitor the system's performance in these areas over time. Right now, we use the VI-SPDAT to define vulnerability for us, just in terms of the questions that it asks. It measures vulnerability for us by producing a score. It tells us how to match to programs. So based on the score, there's a range that it's recommended to match people to rapid rehousing and a range that's recommended to match people to permanent supportive housing. And for the most part, we do adhere to those ranges. And it's a key factor in our prioritization policies. As a reminder, our prioritization policies right now for permanent supportive housing or PSH, we prioritize chronic households. So anybody who's chronic over anybody who's not chronic. Then with the most severe service needs, which we measure using the VI-SPDAT right now, and then the longest length of time homeless. For most of our rapid rehousing, it's the same 3 items, but the bottom 2 are flipped. So we look at length of time before we look at VI-SPDAT score. But either way, you can see that the VI-SPDAT score is a major factor in our prioritization policies. So if we take that out, we need to determine how else we're going to measure severe service need without using that full tool. So if we take that tool out, this is a lot of work that we need to accomplish. So right now we're finishing up phase 0 and phase 1, defining vulnerability and developing a structure for ongoing and immediate work. From there, we'll also have to talk about how we can measure those severe service needs without the VI-SPDAT, so what the assessment will look like. How we'll determine program matching without using the VI-SPDAT, how we'll operationalize service needs with our policies. We actually just added in some access point refinement. So what training, locations, assessor data do we need to look at to make sure that we're supporting the goals that have been established in previous work groups? And then we'll have ongoing analysis and refinement. A lot of work has been done already. We've been working on this since early 2021. There was not a lot of capacity with our community stakeholders, understandably, throughout COVID. So we've been doing what we can throughout 2021. I've been doing a lot of planning, and in 2022, we really kind of hit the ground running, doing some more intensive work groups. So what we've done so far really in phase 1 are listening sessions to hear from the community what their initial thoughts are about how to define severe service needs. Then we did a survey to get some quantitative data. We reviewed existing assessment tools. We collected a lot of tools being used throughout the country and looked at 12 of those to see if there were any starting points, any interesting themes that we could pull out. And then we also received some HUD-TA for CES refinement late 2021, which produced a system change guide, which is really a collection of best practices that we've been using to make sure that this work is structured effectively. So this survey data is relevant to this upcoming work group, so I'm diving into that just a little bit here. It was sent out broadly to the COC, and the answers were also collected at the non-congregate shelter. We had 25 surveys there. So this is one of the interesting points to look at. So in the survey, we took some factors that were already asked in the VI-SPDAT and also some new ideas that came out of the listening sessions. And we asked people to rank them from what they thought was most important to least important. So there were more than 7 factors, but we asked them to choose a top 7. And so this chart shows which factors were ranked in the top 7 most often. So for example, mental health was rated in the top 7 30 times. And of those times, it was in first place 5 times, second place 10 times, third place only maybe once it looks like, fourth place about maybe 7 times. And you can see that breakdown there. So the item that was put in first place most often was old age, although overall it was ranked in the top 7 in third. So out of all the surveys, 25 times it was in one of those top 7 slots. You can see that also low or zero income, mental health, families with minor children, those were placed in the first slot most frequently out of those top 7. This is not dictating the work that we'll be doing in work groups, but I think it's a really important place to start to see what the community kind of had to say about the different factors that we'll be discussing. So this is data that we will be looking at in the work groups as we move forward. Now this is the top rankings by factor. So there were 14 factors that were commonly ranked, and then this is the number of times they were placed in each position, 1st through 7th. So for example, you can see all 14 factors at the bottom. Old age and low or zero income were chosen as most important more often than any other factor. So that bar at the bottom all the way across, that is the first place items. So you can see that light orange, which is old age, was a majority, not a majority, but was a good chunk of the first place ones. And then that blue color, which is the low or zero income, was another good chunk. You can see in second place that pinky color is mental health concerns. That was really the item that was put in second place most frequently. In third place, family with minor children, the gray bar, that was what was there most frequently. So this shows you out of first place, everything that was placed in first place, and then how many times people put that in first place. There are some factors that were not frequently ranked at all. So does not speak English was not ranked. That is not something we currently ask about, but was something that we thought might be interesting. People might be interested in measuring that, but people didn't really choose that. Same with temporary or brief unemployment, people who cannot read or write, large household size, estrangement from family, and lack of friends or healthy supportive relationships. That's what it says. It's hidden behind my video. In phase 0, what we're really focusing on is developing a structure for ongoing and immediate work. So kind of the biggest shift here is just a shift in mindset from this being a one-time project to being ongoing and continuous refinement. So we don't have everything in place right now. We don't have all the answers. We won't have all the answers, but we need to build a structure to continue to monitor our progress towards the common goals that we defined. And then we need to just keep evaluating whether we're moving towards those goals, and if not, what needs to change. So we're finishing up right now a work group that is a CES assessment vision work group. This is focused on defining a common vision for the overall assessment, and the deliverable is being finalized still, but it will be a list of principles for the assessment along with definitions and ways to measure them. So I think this is the final list that will come out of that group. Stay tuned for the final product, but the vision is that it will be equitable, flexible, barrier nuanced, incorporating client choice and assessor input, and lean. So that's the work that has already happened. And right now we are starting a new work group, which is the CES Defining Vulnerability Work Group. This is, again, answering that question, how do we define severe service needs without the VI-SPDAT? And this common definition of vulnerability is wrapping up that structure and common vision phase 0 work for ongoing evaluation. So the deliverable here will be a proposed definition of vulnerability that will be elevated to COC leadership to ensure system alignment. The reason this is so important is because we have more people who need housing resources than we have housing resources available. That is the whole reason that prioritization exists anywhere. If we had enough resources for everyone, we wouldn't need to prioritize who gets them. But because we don't, we do need to choose who will be receiving the limited resources that we have. And our community does that by discussing who are the most vulnerable people, because we want to give them the resources that we have. The core members of this work group are people with lived experience, service providers, CES assessors, and researchers. And the work group values are lived expertise, being trauma-informed and person-centered, racial equity, and data-driven decision-making. What we're doing in this work group, we'll start off with introductions and some foundational learning to get everybody on the same page. Then we'll discuss vulnerability outcomes and domains. So vulnerability outcomes is basically talking about vulnerable to what? Some common examples include vulnerability to death. So without a housing intervention, a person is likely to die unhoused. Could be vulnerability to a long length of time homelessness, so if somebody does not have a housing intervention, they're likely to remain homeless. Returns to homelessness is one that some people look at. High service utilization, like hospitals, ERs, that kind of thing. So that's saying vulnerability to what? That's a vulnerability outcome. And then from there, we'll choose the relevant domains. So for an example, if we decided to go with vulnerability to death, then we're talking about what service needs or barriers do we think mean that somebody is more likely to die unhoused without a housing intervention. So that's where we could talk about maybe severe mental health barriers seem to be a common link to that vulnerability outcome of death. Right now, we'll be kind of discussing almost anecdotally what we think is the most linked. And then after that, we're going to test those domains with real HMIS data. So we'll say if we chose mental health as a domain and we prioritize chronic mental health, length of time homeless, who is now at the top of the pool, and do those seem like the people that would be most likely to have that vulnerability outcome without a housing intervention? So we'll be working with our data analyst, Gwen Beebe, to go through some of that within the work group. And then after that, we'll meet back, we'll discuss what we found during that exercise and adjust our definition as needed. As with most of our CES refinement, this work group recommendation may result in probably not a policy draft here, but a deliverable, probably a printed document, a memo, something like that. This will go to CES leadership group for discussion before being elevated to COC leadership, probably the Blueprint Council, again, just to ensure system alignment before we continue moving forward with the rest of this work. I already talked a little bit about what comes next, but each of these will be its own kind of work group. In our very next upcoming work group, we'll be talking about how we can measure severe service needs without the VI-SPDAT, how we're going to collect that data. So at that point, we should have a set of principles to align the assessment with and a working definition of vulnerability. So we'll kind of put those things together and start saying, for the certain domains we chose, what questions can we ask to get there? We'll continue to measure the outcomes of those questions over time and work towards replacing them with better questions as needed. So best practices say we should start with questions we're already asking, especially if we're unsure if we want to continue asking them, so that we don't keep reassessing clients, re-traumatizing them by asking questions over and over. But we can start with questions we ask now, see how they're working for us, and then make a plan to replace them with more effective questions in the future if needed. There are a lot of resources listed here that are relevant to everything we just talked about. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk more about this. If you're interested in being involved in future work groups, we can see where is the best place to plug you in there as well.